Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo in Java, and specifically, we are going to focus in on the concept of one-dimensional arrays, or as I will sometimes call them, vectors of values. We're specifically going to focus in on arrays of integers, again, one-dimensional. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of different ways to declare and ultimately populate a one-dimensional vector. We are, however, not going to focus on resizing them in this video. Now, much like earlier videos, we're going to start off by creating a public static function that will allow for us to essentially demonstrate this. And so what we want to do is we want to come down to below our main, perhaps right after our help. And we want to start off then with a function that we're going to call public static void. And again, sort of to keep consistent with the earlier videos, we're going to call this array with ints, but I'm going to specify that it is going to be a 1D demo. Again, it's not going to accept any input arguments. It's not going to return anything. Probably want to take a second to go ahead and at least start our comment block, and then we'll make some notes inside on what this specific function is going to do. Now, we're actually going to look at a couple of different examples. We're going to start off with a 1D manual creation. In other words, basically what we're going to do is we're going to declare and then populate the array all at once. And then in the second example, we're going to populate the information in the array via user input. And we're actually going to end up using a scanner here. The idea is that we're going to see then how we could assign a certain number of values to an array based on the size of the array. But again, in both cases, we're actually going to declare it and declare it of a specific size, and we're not going to attempt to resize it. So let's get started on the manual creation. Effectively, what I want to do is I want to create the array, and then I simply want to loop through it. Again, I'm going to sometimes use the terminology of vector. A vector just implies that it's a one-dimensional array. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is to see how to go about actually declaring and initializing then a one-dimensional array. And to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the int data type followed by a set of square brackets. That indicates that it's going to be an array of values and not a singular value. And I'm going to simply call this one vector A. Now, again, this is going to be manual creation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and populate these values by hand. And so I'm just going to use this as somewhat of a countdown, a vector, if you would. It's going to have a total of 5 values. I'm intentionally counting down so we don't confuse it with the index. But the idea here is then this is going to be an int array of 5 values. Now, how do we go about accessing those individual values? Well, to accomplish this, then what we're going to do is we're going to need another variable. We're actually probably going to use it a couple of times here. So I'm going to go ahead and push it up here to the top. We're going to call this then our index, and we are going to go ahead and I guess you could say for safety or just as a reminder's sake, we are going to assign a default value of 0. Now, we will be using a for loop here, so we won't have to worry too much about that. But then what we can do is we can use that for loop to loop through each one of the values in the array, starting at index equals to 0, index less than 5, and then index plus plus. Now, you're probably wondering, where did I get the 5 from? Well, the 5 is nothing more than the length of vector A. As a matter of fact, you will see that I could have accomplished that same thing by actually just specifying vector A dot length. And so we don't necessarily need to have hard-coded that in there, but it does emphasize the point as to why you probably don't want to manually create these vectors as well as manually populate them. And so you will probably end up doing something with resizing then later on. But then what I want to do is I simply want to follow this up using the system.out.println. And then we'll just make a fancy string here that looks at the individual values of vector A as well as the index. And so you can see here, I'm just building a string by a bunch of concatenations. And specifically, we also want to take a look at the value itself, which is going to be vector A, square brackets, and then whatever the index value happens to be. So let's go ahead and build this one. And let's make sure that we don't have any errors. That looks promising. Let's go ahead and grab our function name because we're going to use it as our command line argument. Let's come back up here to our main. And what we can do is then we can just set up another branch of our else if, checking to see that our args.length is in fact equal to 1. And then once we know that, then we can look at what that args square brackets 0 is. And using our equals ignore case, does it in fact match the name of our function? And if both of those conditions are true, well, we simply just want to call our little demo function here. And so in this case, then it's going to be EE333.FundamentalsDemo, and then our ArrayWithInts1DDemo. Now, if you're following along and you haven't set up this giant if structure, that's okay. You can simply just call these functions and manually turn them on and off using the comments. All right, so let's go ahead and build this. Let's go ahead and come out to the command window. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen real quick. I'm going to go ahead and run this now with our EE333.FundamentalsDemo and the ArrayWithInts1DDemo. You can see that I was playing around with this earlier and actually ultimately decided to break this into a couple of different videos. You'll notice also too that I'm sitting in my classes folder here. So we are going to be accessing then the class inside the E333 package. And again, we'll go ahead and hit enter. And you should see then your vector being printed out, starting with the index equal to 0, which hosts the value of 5, index equal to 1, value of 4, and so on. And so this should feel very familiar. Perhaps you looked at this in C or even in MATLAB, with the big difference being that in C, we do use index equal to 0, in other words, 0-based indexing, but in other languages like MATLAB, then you might be familiar with 1-based indexing, which brings us then to one comment that we want to make, and that is that you want to remember that C, as well as Java, uses 0-based indexing, and then, in other words, we start off with 0 as our lowest value in our vector or in our array. Now, what we want to do is we want to look at an alternate way to do this. And in this case, we're going to need a couple of variables, a couple more variables. We are going to go ahead and leave this example alone. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a second one here. Again, it's going to be an array or vector of values. In this case, I'm going to call this vector B. But the big difference is instead of pre-populating it with values, I'm going to use the new constructor and I'm going to tell it that I just simply want 5 values. Now, I don't like the idea of hard coding, so I'm going to take this example one step further, and then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to declare another local variable. I'm going to call it n, and I'm simply going to set it equal to 5. What this does, this allows for us then to put a variable inside of our constructor. And I think you can guess then that we could also pass the argument n to our function. And then at that point, then we can decide at runtime what size the array needs to be. So again, this does not have to be hard coded in there. We simply can use a variable then and have essentially a variable size array. Now, at this point, then what we want to do is we want to come up with a way to collect the information from the user via the command line, which then means that we need to have, much like in earlier examples, a java.util.scanner that we are simply going to call scanner. And we're going to use the new constructor here to create our new java.util.scanner. And we want to use then the system.in as the source for the scanner. Now, at this point, we just simply need a couple of additional variables. Basically, we need a way to not only iterate through our vector B, but we also want to have the ability to collect and then assign values to our vector B. And specifically, we will recall that when we used the scanner before, we could accidentally throw an exception if, for instance, we thought that it was going to be a string, or rather, we thought it was going to be an int or a double, and we ended up with a string. And so what we want to do to get around that is we actually want to use a function in the scanner class called hasNext, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But the idea is I want to have a variable then that can capture whatever the values for the scanner or from the scanner are. And so we're going to have two separate variables, again, partially for demonstration purposes. But the first one is going to be value as int, and I'm going to again set this to a default value. And I'm also going to want to have a java.lang string and value as string. Now, I'll talk in a later video about why we would use an object versus a primitive. Again, for right now, we're just going to focus in on this example using the scanner. And the idea then is I want to reinitialize my index equal to 0 since I've used it earlier. I need to remember to do that. And then what we first want to do is we want to loop through the existing values in our vector B. And so to start off with, we will have for index equal to 0, index now less than n, or we could also leverage the length of vector B and then simply increment our index. Now, I'll come back to why I initialize this in just a second, or reinitialize it twice. You'll see why and when we start to run this. But then we want to have then a system.out.println, very similar to what we had for our vector A. As a matter of fact, you could probably just go ahead and simply copy and paste with a few changes the code that we have earlier. And the idea is I want us to see what those default values are inside of vector B. And so all we're going to do is we're simply going to loop through each of the values on the console. And it probably would be a good idea to throw in an extra system.out.println just so that we can have some borders between these examples. Otherwise, it's going to get a little confusing. My autocomplete seems to be having a little bit of fun with me here. All right, and we'll save this for later because we'll probably need another border, but let's go ahead and build this and let's see what we have now. And so remember, in the first example, we actually assigned values to it. In the second one, then we're just looking at the default values. And sure enough, the default values for an integer, if we have declared our array the way we have done it, are going to be 0. And so effectively, unlike in C, where it was garbage or unpredictable, in this particular case, then we will get a default value of 0. All right, so let's continue on. Let's see how we can actually use our scanner now to collect the values from the user. And now what we have to do is we have to go ahead and reinitialize our index to 0. We're going to use a while loop. And what we're going to do is we're going to base it around the number of elements in the array. So in other words, while index is less than n, we want to attempt to collect information from the user. And the first step to that is going to simply be a system.out.println. And we need to ask the user for the information. So please enter an integer. And then we want to follow this up not with our scanner.next, but with our scanner.hasNext. And what we'll see then is that our scanner has these helper functions that allow for us to essentially peek at what the next value is. In this case, what we're interested in is to see if it has a next int. And if that returns true, then what we can do is we can store it and then ultimately put it into our array. So we're going to do this as a two-step process. What we want to do is we want to capture it first using our value as int variable. We're going to use the scanner.nextInt. And then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to store it in our vector B at the given index. So square brackets index. And again, we don't technically have to do this as a two-step process, but it's good to see the two steps. And you'll see in just a second when we focus on the else branch why I'm doing it this way. So the third thing that we want to do here then, of course, is to remember to increment our index, because otherwise we're just going to be overriding that first value over and over again and effectively writing an infinite loop. But under the else branch, then what we want to do is we essentially want to capture and then throw away whatever was not an integer. And so the way we can do this is we can use this value as string variable that we created earlier. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the scanner. And this time, though, I'm going to use the scanner.next line, in which case I'm just going to capture everything on that next line, regardless of what it is. And I'm going to provide then some sort of feedback back to the user here using the system.out.println. And again, just some sort of error or warning that says, please enter a string or perhaps integer not provided. However you would like to word this back to the user. And then what we can do is we can actually show the user what they did wrong by simply leveraging that variable. So system.out.println. And then in this case, then our value as string. Now, the reason I wanted to do this as a two-step process is up here in the if statement, then you could do, or in the true branch of the if statement, you can do something similar also with a system.out.println, except you can provide them with a nice friendly message that says note collected value, and maybe something like provide the value as well. And again, this is partially for demonstration purposes, but hopefully you see the benefit of these local variables. Now, I want to follow this up with one more table border, if you would. And again, what I want to do is I want to loop through all of the values using our for loop from earlier. And so the idea is that we can get sort of a before and after snapshot of our vector, including the indexes. And at this point, let's go ahead and build it. Come out to your command prompt. Let's go ahead and rerun our ArrayWithInts1DDemo. And again, remember that we still have that first one in there. You could arguably comment that out. You can improve on it however you would like to, but more importantly, notice here that I'm being prompted for an integer. We're going to start off by giving it a valid value. And so you'll see that it says note collected value 2. That means it acknowledged that as an integer. We'll do one more. So there's our 4. And then we're going to go off the rails here. We're going to put in an A. And you'll see now we have a message that says error int not provided. And so you can see here where you've got some basic error checking in here. We'll go ahead and throw in a 6, maybe an 8. And then for the 5th value, then a 10. You can see that I'm only allowed to collect 5 values. You'll throw an exception if you accidentally try to assign a 6th value or attempt to assign a value outside of the bounds of your array, including if you attempt to assign an index or, access a negative index. But hopefully you can see here now that our before and after snapshots of our vector. First, the default values are 0. After we've went through the process of collecting the information from the user, we now have these values in it. So as always, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.